Hello and welcome to Good Food on Earth podcast. My guest today is Dawn Moncrief, and she is the board director and president of A Well-Fed World. She's also been a social justice advocate since 1999 and has 2 MA degrees from George Washington University. And her work highlights the ways in which high levels of meat consumption in the US and globally exacerbate global hunger, especially for women and children. And it also draws attention to the negative consequences of animal agriculture on climate change, including harm caused by local small-scale grazing operations. So thank you for joining us today, Ms. Moncrief.
Great to be here, thank you.
And I want to introduce A Well-Fed World with its mission statement and philosophy before we go into it a little bit, because I do think that its mission statement gives a pretty clear picture, and philosophy give a pretty clear picture of what a well-fed world would be like. So A Well-Fed World, it's a food security and environmental advocacy organization advancing plant-based foods and farming to create a sustainable and hunger-free world that maximizes health and minimizes harm. And basically, a well-fed world is one in which all people have enough food and the right kinds of food, and those are ones that maximize health and minimize harm. It's a world where people are not underfed, suffering from hunger, malnutrition, or dehydration. A world in which people are not overfed, suffering from heart disease, cancer, stroke, and diabetes. And a world in which the food systems nourish and protect people, animals, and the planet. So it sounds like a place I'd like to be.
Yes.
I wonder if we could start off with a little background and you could tell us a bit about how and why a well-fed world got started.
Sure. So I was vegetarian from being a teenager and cared about the animals, and so that was my primary motivation. But even since before that, as a young person, have always just felt really drawn to the issue of hunger. My mom was a social worker, so I think probably that's where it stems. And then in the 80s, the famine in Ethiopia was very influential in terms of just being emotionally powerful and so unnecessary, and especially that wasn't just some kind of something that just happened that we could have done something about, but something that's systemic, and the hunger that is just not even news because it's not new. That's the whole thing, where you have more than 20,000 people dying every year of hunger and hunger-related causes. The distinction being not necessarily starving, but hunger-related causes also. So there's some nuance there, but it is very real, and it doesn't get treated that way globally as something that we need to handle and make a priority. So I had wanted to work on those issues, and then, like I said, as a teenager, became vegetarian, but I hadn't become vegan till probably mid-20s, and I hadn't ever heard of what veganism was, and I was in grad school in DC, and a friend of a friend said, oh, well, if you care about animals, you should be vegan. And I was like, well, what's that? And then they were coming for my pizza and my ice cream, and this is back before we had as many good options. So I wasn't just gonna give up pizza and ice cream without checking into it. And as I did, I started reading about the impact globally on terms of resource use and environment and global food security. So like a lot of folks, I thought, well, it's okay if I choose to be vegetarian or vegan, but I certainly, wouldn't tell other people, low-income people, rural communities around the world, that they should also be vegetarian or vegan. Mm-hmm. And we still actually wouldn't tell them in that way, but what we're doing, and I guess we'll get to it more, is in terms of working against the pro-meat biases that are there that are actually harmful. And so then in the research, realizing the impact of animal agriculture globally, and that it wasn't a secret, it wasn't, people know, and the International Food Policy Research Institute in 1999, when I was working on this in grad school, had a report called Livestock to 2020, which talked about the massive harm to global food security and environment caused by the livestock sector, but they wouldn't recommend reduction. So they laid out all this harm, they laid out this global trend of massive increases, doubling over 20 to 50 years, depending on the count, and said, well, how can we meet that demand? And they actually specifically acknowledged well-meaning development partners and then just dismissed it that, well, it's demand driven, so we're not going to say reduction. We just have to figure out how to meet it, causing the least harm possible. And that is actually what's shifted my focus. I was planning to work at the World Bank to work on poverty issues. And then, you know, as I was in grad school and learning more, actually working across the street basically from the World Bank, was like, oh, okay, maybe that's not the best fit, because a lot of times, a lot of great people there, but sometimes the policies are more harmful than good, and that I would actually be able to have more influence outside and to be an advocate as opposed to, you know, part of the machinery. And yeah, so then I did the second master's degree. I was able to frame using a vegan lens, and it was in women's studies. And so connected the global hunger issues with women and children, girls in particular, in low-income countries, and the impact that animal agriculture has in undermining food security, and specifically in higher income countries like the US. So I know that we've got a lot of time, we can touch on that, but even still, our focus is on reductions in high income countries, middle income countries, you know, where there's access to alternatives, and then reducing the meat biases that go into promoting meat and dairy and eggs in countries that don't need it. So it's an important distinction, because there's a lot of times where pro plant-based, pro vegan messaging gets framed that we're trying to take food away from the world's poor, and or that there's a conflation of farming that might be animal farming within these lower income countries where they don't have access, and then somehow that gives a pass for eating hamburgers or chicken or dairy, whatever it is that we want to eat in the US. It doesn't matter if there's some rural countryside in Ethiopia that has use for draft power. That doesn't excuse the food, not just meat and dairy, but you know, the animal agriculture, the livestock products that we're eating now, and that's causing all this immense harm in terms of resource use and of course climate change. So ever since the 2006 livestock long shadow report that the UN came out with, and they put that title where they regret it so much in terms of saying that it was more than all transportation combined, that the veg communities have just taken and run with. Me also, as soon as I was like, whoa, that's, you know, we need to run with that, and then also continue. Now it's really starting to finally, climate is starting to be taken seriously, and the diet contributions. So our focus has shifted. We started with climate and food security, and then we shifted and did more with animals for a bit, and now we're coming back and really just hitting climate, but also of course in terms of food security. And then we do still also draw on the animal issues.
Great. And you know, people are hearing a lot about climate change and the impact of animal agriculture. And we keep hearing in the news that, you know, plant-based, eat more plant foods, eat less meat. We heard it earlier this year in January from the Lancet report. There was a recent report signed by 11,000 scientists from 153 countries. A lot of articles covered by George Nambia in The Guardian. And even the Canadian Food Guide, we were lucky enough that they actually went with some of the science and nutrition this year and came out with a food guide that doesn't include dairy, and you don't have to eat meat. They have a section that's just protein, and that includes plant proteins like legumes and other things that are have higher protein content. But so we've heard about this, but I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about why a well-fed world takes that plant-based approach, like dig into the reasons a little bit.
Well, it's a win-win-win. So I'm somebody who can often see multiple sides and say, well, there's this, but this. And one of the things that just struck me so powerfully about veganism is there really is no downside for the most part. It's more just a managing of, how to get the foods, or, the convenience factor for a lot of us, and having things that taste familiar. But in terms of health, environment, global food security, animals, a plant-based diet is superior across the board. And it's funny that vegans, I'm not quite sure who all your audience is, but maybe we should discuss that too, because I can know who to frame the.
Well, we've got a bit of a mixture.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So my focus is it's been a lot on the nutrition aspect. So a lot of people who are interested and who have changed their lives through whole food plant-based nutrition.
Great.
There's a good bit of my audience, and then I think I might have a few people who are interested in the sustainability part as well. So that's kind of who you're talking to.
Okay. Well, hi.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. And where was I? All right.
We were doing the plant-based approach and how it's like good across the board, and some of the reasons why. Yeah.
Oh yeah, now I know. Yeah, the point. So a lot of times vegans get framed as being sentimental. So if you're for folks who are whole food plant-based diet, if you're doing it for health, then people will not kind of have as much pushback a lot of times if somebody's plant-based for health reasons. But if you're vegan for environment or animals, there's this idea of vegans kind of being sentimental. But actually, we have the science, we have the facts, and it's people who are eating meat and dairy that they are clinging to the diet choices because the diet change is uncomfortable. So on the one hand, reducing meat and dairy consumption and egg consumption is quite easy, and we have it very easy. In other ways, though, emotionally, just because there's access, emotionally, diet change is difficult for some people. There's actually this study that I was interested in reading, talking about how different it is for folks. That it's a spectrum in terms of your kind of emotional attachment and drive, and that I forgot how it's framed. I should freshen up on that. But it was very interesting and helpful for me as an advocate to also read that, because some people are able to switch their diet very easily, and others struggle, and that there's this kind of an emotional attachment, for lack of a better word, in terms of desire and drive for particular foods. So maybe also kind of a addiction is a proper word, but it's also stronger than I necessarily want to use. But just kind of that being compelled towards certain foods, and I know that I struggle with it in terms of sugar. So that also keeps a reminder in my head that it's not always easy to change. But in terms of health, especially whole foods, plant-based, that is absolutely. I mean, I don't know how anybody could fight against that in terms of being top tier in terms of health choices. And then same with the environment, and same with the animals. So less processing across the board also will impact animals and the environment. And so, that your folks there, if you're doing whole food plant-based, you are top of the top, points. I'm not there, but I'm striving to be there more and more. And I just had some chocolate covered frozen bananas for our interview. So I'm not quite sure how that counts. It's like, oh, sweet chocolate dip.
Oh,
yeah. But, so yeah, that's what pulled it together. Anyway, all the things pulled together, and I was like, this is it. Why is this not at least being promoted? And I understand a lot of times, and you see this with exercise as well, and health, and all these things where they're just doing slight promotions because people won't go for it.
Right. Yeah.
But we really need to tell people this is the ideal.
Mm-hmm.
This is the ideal. If you don't get there, at least you know what the ideal is, and people know they shouldn't drink soda. They know they shouldn't smoke. burgers, whether they're vegan burgers or beef burgers, that's not health food. So I don't, whether we touch on that, but people a lot of times are like, oh, is the Beyond Burger, Impossible Burger, are they healthier? It's like, well, they're healthier, but it's not health food. Nobody eats a burger for health, unless maybe it's one of those like little green ones. But but that's not why. Even then, you got the bun, you got condiments. So, yeah, nobody's eating a burger for health. So not to frame it against this kind of impossible, no pun intended, standard.
Right. Yeah, I think like you're saying, it's important to get the information out there, and I think one of the things is, not trying to manipulate people into change, but providing that information, respecting that it's their choice, and saying, look, here's, and this is what I like about a well-fed world, and what we're going to get into is that you actually provide research, and people can look into the topics. They've got questions about, well, how does a plant-based focus or plant-based food system, what is its effect on hunger? Like, I can dig into that. What's its effect on the environment? And it's not just somebody spouting a catchphrase to me and saying like, well, everybody's doing this now, like you should jump on board, or somebody saying like, trying to make you feel guilty, like the climate's in trouble. Why aren't you eating, like, why are you eating that hamburger? Don't you know how much water goes into producing a hamburger? None of those things actually work, but providing the information like a well-fed world does, I think it's a great way to go. I'd like to go into one of the first research topics and what we touched on already, and that's hunger. So you could correct me if I'm wrong, but when I looked at the numbers, it's something like 840 million people out of the 7 billion people on the planet are counted as suffering from chronic hunger. You have, as you mentioned, there were some people dying of hunger-related causes every day, and 6,000 of them are children. And I found that shocking that it's more than 250 children an hour die from hunger-related causes. And so I did some research and looked in the US this year that more than 41 million people face hunger, and 13 million of them are children. So we are really aware of people in other countries because of commercials and advertising, like in Africa, but also in the US, there are people facing hunger. And here in Canada this year, 1 in 8 households will struggle to access healthy food. Most people aren't aware that their food choices contribute to something like hunger, to the way food systems are developed. But how do our current food systems contribute to hunger and to poverty?
Yeah, so this is the core of a well-fed world, is this issue, and we work at the systems level, and so global systems in terms of resource use and supply and demand. In terms of the numbers, I don't want to miss getting back to the numbers since we're on that now. One of the things that we do, which I think is very helpful for people who are kind of at an advanced level of trying to understand things, so not necessarily researchers themselves, but either academics or just people who are, again, kind of a 201 as opposed to a 101. A lot of times if you go to a veg fest, and we'll speak to the issues, and you kind of have just a very basic level. But I think people who are watching your podcast are probably interested in things at a more advanced level. So we'll cover the 101, but also in terms of the 201, the more advanced level. Those hunger statistics, almost all statistics are conservative that you're going to see from mainstream outlets. So that's one of the things that a well-fed world does in terms of that 201, is breaking down some of the numbers and explaining it and explaining why they're conservative. And so we're going to get a chance to address that here with the hunger numbers, but also feed conversion numbers and the climate numbers are areas that we focus on so that we can connect with here. That number is an extreme underestimate. You can easily double that number. So anytime people talk about the 800 million, 840 million. They'll talk about a decline to 840 million and how it used to be 1.2 billion. What you read was the underfed, overfed, well-fed. That was a World Watch magazine article from the 90s that talked about overfed and underfed. And so this concept of where you have this massive overconsumption, not just of food, but all kind of products and energy, overconsumption in the US and high income countries, including Canada. And then the severe underfed and under-resourced communities. And at the time I was doing it, it was about 1.2 billion each. They were talking about the world's underfed and overfed. And now again, so you'll see this number decreasing to 840 million, but it's not so much a decrease as a change of count. And they, have the SDRs, the sustainable goals, where they're trying to reduce consumption by 50% over 20, 30 years, kind of a thing. And they were not able to make their mark as it was coming up, and they switched up the accounting and how they did the numbers so that they would be more closely make their mark. I mean, it's shocking that they can do that. But even beyond that, so we have an article linked on the website, but you can also just look it up, called Why Hunger Matters, and it's by Frances Moore Lappé, who many of your listeners may know. She's, the one who first was bringing these issues to the front in Small Planet, Diet for a Small Planet. So she talks about it and the ways in which it's counting sedentary. So it's basing the caloric intake on sedentary, how you have to have not have hunger for a year or more uninterrupted. And there's just all these factors that undercounts it by at least half and maybe even more. So I think when you're thinking in terms of people who don't have access to food at an extreme level, you really need to actually think about half the world's global population. That number easily is at 1.5 billion, double it. But even still, you're talking about people in the most dire straits. If you go to 3 billion or more, you are still talking about people who are really severely under-resourced and don't have access to enough calories or quality calories. So just to address that number, because I always on the one hand, you can't even get your mind around what 840 million looks like, which is more than double the US population at 325 million or so now. Mm-hmm. And so that number is extreme hunger. A lot of times people are living on less than $1 a day. Mm-hmm. And that's price parity. That's not a US dollar in, a continent or a country that is making much less. So, right. All right, but hunger. All right, so how the issues relate to hunger. So it's not as direct. A lot of times, if growing up and you're like, oh, you should eat your food because people are hungry in China. I'm trying not to actually specify certain countries and stuff because there's so much racism and biases. Except that countries in Africa and Asia are the countries that are hit most with hunger. Asia in raw numbers because they're so much bigger, and then Africa in terms of percentage. But that's what a lot of people hear. And so it's not so easy that we don't waste food. I know we're going to address food waste at some point, or we cut back our meat consumption and it frees up more resources, and then those crops are automatically given to low-income countries. So it doesn't impact it that way. There's a lot of political and socioeconomic will that needs to be focused globally, and also in the US and Canada. There's hunger everywhere. And somebody had been asking me about that. I was like, yeah, every country has hunger. I don't know, maybe Denmark, I don't know. But I don't. Yeah. I actually don't know that the best countries, but I'm pretty sure there probably still is hunger. But I should take that back. But walk it back a little bit. But I actually believe that's probably accurate.
Yeah. So I mean, how do the food systems, the way they're set up, how do they contribute to this, to hunger and poverty?
So most directly, I like to focus on the supply and demand aspect, because animals consume so much more crops
Mhm.
So much more food than they produce. So just at the basic level, animals eat much more food than they produce.
Mhm.
And we'll go into a little bit more of that later. But if you think about that, then what we're doing is we're using up more global resources, and that's putting price pressure on crops. So it's not just like, oh, we don't need it, and then we ship it over there or make it available. To the contrary, what's happening is you have these low-income countries with high food insecurity and high hunger levels that are exporting their own food to be used as animal feed or livestock products for wealthier countries, middle and higher income countries and things like that. So you're actually pulling out local resources away from people who could be using it, as well as just generally increasing the price pressure. And so I tried to do a little bit of a supply and demand example to try to help folks understand that if I have 10 apples and there's a pig farmer who wants 8 of those apples, and I have 8 humans, then that pig farmer can pull up the prices because he's increasing demand. Where before, if I have $1 an apple for everybody and there's equal supply and demand, but if you have somebody who's a pig farmer, who's wealthy pig farmer, who's like making meat for wealthy people, and he's like, I can give you $2 an apple, and then it pulls the price up and out of the reach of many people. So maybe there's an individual or two who's like, I can pay $3 an apple, but maybe other people can't afford it. And it works better if I have a graph. Usually if I'm doing this, I have a PowerPoint so you can see it, but hopefully that, like we know the opposite of a sale too, right? So say if all of a sudden there's extra of something, right? So if we stop having this great demand pulling resources for animal products, and we have extra apples, now we can put them on sale because we got to do something with these apples that we have. And so we lower the price and then more people have access to it. So maybe that's a way of understanding that if we stop using all these crop resources to be used for animal feed, it makes more available, that the price pressure can be decreased. And so that people, especially in urban areas, urban poor, where it's impacted by price. So there's other areas that are not as much on an economic system that it impacts it differently. But that's a pretty tangible way. And that's assuming all else is equal. Not all else is equal. There's other pressures on supply and stuff like that in terms of pricing. But that is still a key aspect where you can either increase price pressure or decrease price pressure and the impact that that's going to have. And also, again, reducing the demand to pull resources out of these really impoverished countries. And again, when we're talking about Ethiopia, I had learned that during the famine, they were exporting food, the 80s famine. They were exporting food, and then also learned that, oh, that's actually standard practice, whether it's famine or just chronic hunger and malnourishment, that the countries will still be exporting food. And we work with partners in Ethiopia, and when we were going to the market, all the good produce actually goes to the Middle East. And like all the produce available for local consumption. And, that was a particular area, but we were in the capital city. So it wasn't that we were just off in a rural area. So it's also not just feed crops, it's crops more generally as well. There's all kinds of politics around that. So, but so that's the main first thing that we focus on is the overconsumption of global crops by animals used for food. So sorry if using the term livestock is troublesome for some folks. There's that, but now also the environment in terms of the pollution is what we used to focus on a lot, is land use and pollution, things of that nature. And now we're focusing on climate. So we can still talk about the ways in which desertification and deforestation are impacting global hunger, but because climate is so massive and just coming in so hard and hitting a point soon where, if we're not already there, where we're past the point of no return, that our meat consumption is fueling global warming, and that is impacting sea levels, it's impacting crop yields, and then of course natural disasters. And the places getting hit hardest by natural disasters are the countries who are the poorest and who have contributed the least greenhouse gases. And this isn't just this nonprofit world. We've been going up to the UN high-level forum meetings and at the climate meetings, so they know this. This is something they talk about, but there's just still not enough movement. So when we were talking before about guilting folks or this or that, it's, you know, it's a tool. For those of us who care about climate change, we want to know what we can do. There's a lot of debating whether or not the livestock sector is more than the transportation sector or the energy sector. And, you know, it's useful. It's a nice talking point when we had it at the UN, then went back and reduced their number. We think there's some politics around that, actually, so it would come in just under transportation. But how do you count that? Is transportation counted that is taking animal feed for livestock? Is it counting transportation of animal products and the extra refrigeration they take and the extra clean-in that they take that requires electricity and things of that nature? So there's some politics around that, but regardless, and I guess we'll go back and talk about the 51% number also, but it's massive. It's massive, and it's something that we can do, and we don't have to decide, well, do I not eat a hamburger, or do I drive a hybrid, or do I turn off my lights, or do I take a shorter shower, and all the things that we're trying to do to be better in terms of the environment and climate. But this is absolutely key in terms of what we can do. It's much more that we can do as individuals, and let's make sure to circle back around to methane, that we can do as individuals and have a much more immediate impact because of the methane issue, and it shouldn't be, we shouldn't have to compare it. It's a complementary. We need to do all we can.
Right. Yeah. And I want to touch on, because I did look, I looked at the UN's projection of how meat consumption was supposed to double by 2050, not just consumption, but production. And in response to this, in March 15th of this year, the FAO issued a report that stated that it has a program to, quote, assist member countries in exploiting the opportunities for livestock development and poverty alleviation through the promotion of safe, efficient, and sustainable production, processing, and marketing of meat and meat products. And it also states that meat is the most valuable livestock product, and that it provides high quality protein and highly bioavailable minerals and vitamins. So people who have been educated with the whole food plant-based world, they'll know there's some issues with regards to the nutrition statement, but with regards to alleviating hunger and poverty, what this report says, can livestock production do that?
So it's complicated. Not in the way that they stated, as in these big broad terms when we again talk about the meat biases and the livestock biases. So first I'll go back to just make the distinction again between what we're doing in middle and high income countries and our meat consumption and dairy and egg consumption, and how that report does not give a pass to anything that we're doing in our own diets, and this should actually not impact anybody's personal decision who's watching this, unless they work in the sector dealing with global hunger, and then they should listen to what I have to say and look at our website and consider broader possibilities. But so addressing this, so there is this biases that meat consumption, so what they're saying is that of the animal products that it's given, so that meat is more important than dairy and eggs, is how they're stating that, is that it's the most valuable product. I'm sure they're going to be in favor of all of those things. And then they're also, if they didn't talk about it, often we'll talk about draft power and fertilizer. So in specific areas where there's not access to other types of farming or resources, the idea that you could have a few animals and that they would have draft power and fertilizer benefits is legitimate. If you think of terms of like Heifer International and Oxfam going in with these animal gifting programs, that's not often how they work. A lot of times because of the problems with desertification and overgrazing, that the animals are not allowed to actually graze. They're kept, it's they're confined inside sheds, so it's not to the same level in terms of numbers and the stocking densities necessarily, but you just don't know. Like they could have, say, 20 animals stocked in very small confinement. So you're not having tens of thousands, but you still have small numbers. So sometimes people might be wealthy enough to have a barn, but oftentimes they don't. You still have to provide food for animals. You have to provide water, medical care. It's not just that you have this golden cow or goat or whatever it is who's there just, and then once you slaughter them, they're gone. Sure, they can have babies, but then again, you've got to feed and water and take care of babies. And a lot of times, there's if you don't have enough animals in the first place, you can easily kind of lose your care. You'll start having problems with, births and things like that. So it's also not just like, oh, I get 2 animals and then they'll just keep reproducing and make enough. So there's all kinds of problems with that. It's also, you don't know that could that land be used for other things. So there's a lot of opportunity costs that are not being considered. If there wasn't a meat bias, could there be teff or quinoa or lentils? What else is there? There's a big misconception because they talk about non-arable land. But non-arable land isn't just like, okay, well then it can just be grazed. Like it's overgrazed. I mean, animals eat a lot.
Yeah.
They eat a lot. They eat a lot of grass. Like your grass is going to run out. That's why herders move, right? But you're talking about communities that are not herding communities. And even herding communities start suffering when the resources, we're having global warming, the crops are drying up, grasslands and things are also drying up. It's not some kind of magic, again, like a magic cow, like a magic bean or something that just is going to alleviate hunger. It's very complicated, and it's also in terms of resiliency and natural disasters, it's not ideal for that. So really, what you want to do is try to get biodiversity, different crops and that work together, and sometimes animals can be part of that, but ideally not rely on it, and then also not importing it. And you also see with Heifer International and Oxfam, and unfortunately UNFAO, World Bank, IFC, all these organizations going in and promoting dairy in areas that are traditionally lactose intolerant. So the poorest regions in the world are also highly lactose tolerant. And it's not just this kind of benign system of like, oh, we're well-meaning and we don't really know these things. It's quite calculating, because also then a lot of times animals do need feed. It helps bring in a dairy industry where there wasn't one, and so sometimes it'll come in and you'll have a local, bring in the local farms, and then you get people acclimated to having dairy, and then the foreign companies can come in and start undermining the local farming systems. We're working on a dairy globalization paper right now that's touching on some of that. So if people have a particular interest, stay tuned and keep in touch with us. We'll hopefully be releasing that before too long. We're still kind of in the draft formation of it.
Yeah, I think it's something like 3/4 of the world's population are lactose intolerant. And as far as I know, when everybody's a baby, they have an ability to digest lactose from mother's milk, and then you're effectively supposed to be weaned off of it. People, I think, with ancestry from more northern countries were able to keep that ability to digest lactose for longer. But it is kind of crazy that, giving milk to people who just don't have the enzymes to digest it. And I want to touch back on, you mentioned Frances LeFay and her work talking about hunger, and with that introduction of dairy too. I wonder if we could just touch on briefly, like, what are the long-term effects of hunger on a person, and what can that mean in the broader picture of their society?
Oh, yeah, it's horrible. And then her paper will touch on that, the newest one out, and first, actually it's quite well researched that the first 100 days are so critical in terms of being nourished and having enough access to calories and having milk from mothers that are healthy, and that the kind of stunting that happens early on limits the abilities for the future, regardless of, okay, say when you're 4, you start having adequate nutrition, which often doesn't happen that way, but regardless, you're stunted at what you're going to be able to achieve. And then you have students who are not, I mean, if you just think in the US, if you think about yourself, if you got your lunch money one day and how hard it is to concentrate, and just this chronic hampering down of what people can have the energy to learn, what they're able to learn, their ability to leverage that into making something meaningful. And so you have to think that part of what's happening also maybe not just that there's a lack of political will, but that there's political benefits to keeping populations subdued. And I often try to give the benefit of the doubt and say they're not trying to necessarily do that, that sometimes you basically have an elite alliances within lower income countries, because lower income countries still have extremely wealthy populations. It's just massive income inequality, but extremely wealthy populations in the lowest of income countries who work with international business and high income countries. And, so sometimes maybe they just want what they want, right? And what do they have to give? They have crops. So they're going to take those crops to use for animal feed so that they can have foreign exchange. They have to be able to sell something to have foreign exchange to buy the military or the luxury items that they want to have. And so that's what I like to think is the primary motivation, is that they just want their goodies, and that's how they have to get them. They're not actually trying to hurt people. But the secondary benefit is that you do have a subdued population. And then internationally, also similarly. So you can make a case, hey, if you don't have a subdued population and they have access to resources, they could become consumers, and that would help markets. So those types of arguments are made, but that's the other downside. So in terms of nutrition, yeah, you can't learn, you can't grow. You're not physically able to either do the things to help the community improve, or maybe fight the inequality, right? So then you maybe aren't energized and don't have the resources to make the system a more fair one.
And I want to address what the FAO said about, production, processing, and marketing of meat and meat products as being efficient and sustainable. So we kind of touched on that, like, if you gift an animal to a family, like even here, people are interested in homesteading. And I remember looking into this and thinking, well, yeah, if you get an animal, you've got to look after it. You have to, there's the vet bills, there's the feed that you have to get it shelter. And it doesn't seem to be regenerative in terms of contributing back to the land and that sort of thing. But, can there be efficient and sustainable livestock production? And especially when you compare it to production of whole plant foods.
Right. I mean, if you're comparing it to whole plant foods, then you're really at quite a loss. If you're comparing it to factory farming systems, then there are improvements, but not to the degree that a lot of folks think. So when you were talking about people who want to homestead and have animals, I'll go back to the issue of why. Like, why are they so compelled? Is it really that they think that the nutrition is needed? And if so, then please do some research, because it's just not the case. Is it that they're emotionally tied to having meat, eggs, dairy, and address that? I mean, the smaller scale is also, it's a slaughter industry, just like the rest. And so if it's about animals, remember, the best way you can help animals is to not consume them, not to eat them, not to use them for food. And so there can be some exceptions to this, but my concern is that the exceptions then justify the greater abuses that happen. And so some folks are going to just be, say, if they're talking about like having some backyard chickens. So I actually was just at a house, and they had about half a dozen hens and a rooster. And I was like, oh, do you eat them? And they're like, no, and they did. They had names for them. They ate their eggs. They shared their eggs. And so a system like that, I'm like, okay. And there are problems for people who do it, just so you know, like when you get shipped hens, like half all the boy hens were destroyed in the process, die all the time. It's still not a great process. But if you were taking an example like that, those hens are happy. They don't care about, the eggs. But that is the most benign, ideal case that is then used to justify. So most people who are raising hens and for eggs, well, what happens to the roosters and the male chicks are killed? Are you going to keep feeding and taking care of the hens when they are not producing? Are they basically pets that you're just taking care of? That's one thing that a lot of folks don't, because they don't have the resources. If they're trying to save money or use this as a way of having food security because they are economically insecure, then they're not going to be able to keep the chicken. So then again, that's a slaughter industry. In terms of beef and ruminant animals, so cows, sheep, goats, they have the dual stomach. And when they are eating their roughage, so hay and grass, when they're eating their natural foods, this is what creates the methane. And so usually what happens is that there's a trade-off. The people who are using grazing methods are going to tout the environmental benefits, and there are some in terms of less pollution, and there can also be some in terms of animal welfare. But the climate impact is much, much greater. So ruminant animals grazing in grass, roughage, hay, type feed crops, not feed crops, but their own natural foods when they're grazing, emit 3 to 4 times more greenhouse gases. So the methane that they produce is much greater, and as we'll discuss, methane is a much, much more powerful greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide, and more than, again, people who are familiar with just the basics of it may know the numbers between 20 and 25 times more potent of a greenhouse gas. And we start talking about these numbers, and it's difficult to really even understand how much that is. I mean, I don't know, like I don't have PowerPoint, so I'm like, oh, okay, like if I have a pen, and then I'm like, okay, a cow eats 10 times more food than, talking about feed conversion ratio, 10 times more. Well then, okay, now this is how much more, like that's a lot. And then, or if methane is, if this is 1 carbon, so it's called global warming potential. So carbon is 1, and if we say methane counts for 20 to 25, this is 10, then you got to add in another 10. Like this is how many, like 1 methane is like this many carbons. But this is only, so this is what we were talking about before, 20 to 25 times. Like that's a massive amount of carbon, right? But that's over a 100-year time frame. And this is, again, where the numbers are so conservative. So this is a 100-year time frame. Massive, 25 times is massive amount more than 1. Over a 20-year time frame, which is actually much more relevant in terms of what the kind of time we have and what we need to do, it's 84. Wow. 84 to 86 times more potent of a greenhouse gas. So again, now we're having like this many pins. And if it's over a 5-year time frame, it's 100 times more potent of a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. So that's why you hear methane, methane, methane. And then we'll add on deforestation on top of that. But methane, methane, methane. So yeah, we have methane, which is like creating this much more carbon, greenhouse gas for 1 little carbon dioxide. And then it has a much shorter half-life. So the thing is that if we can pull it out, it's going to have a much more immediate impact. So carbon's up there for 100 years. If we can pull out methane, that the methane that's there is going to come out within the next like 10 years, 10, 12 years. Most of the methane will come out. And so if we stop putting it back in, we can free up some of the greenhouse gases, because the methane will come out. We just need to stop putting it back in. All right, tying it back into the smaller income, right? So the smaller farming.
Mm-hmm.
So we have all these cows and goats and sheep out there grazing, bringing all this methane in, and they're expecting those numbers to increase, even though there's a lot of shifting. You see, kind of like in the U.S., there's some shifting away from beef to more poultry. Pigs also, but poultry a lot. But we're still top consumers globally, and when you're talking about bringing in ruminant animals into lower income countries, that's also where you have the highest population growth. So there's a lot of folks who like to focus on the harm of population growth and trying to limit that, which there are benefits to that, but it needs to be part of the equation, but you also have to be very conscious about how you do that, because it tends to be where you're blaming a lot of folks in the US and other high income countries. You see these researchers blaming population growth. Well, we've got the population, we need to feed the growing population. The growing population is putting all this pressure on the food system. And when they're talking about growth, again, they're talking about Asia a lot. And then also African countries have a lot of times high relative growth rates, but the consumption rate is so much lower. So anytime people talk about birth rates and how much is being consumed by these high birth rates, you have to balance it against this massive overconsumption in high income countries, so that it's not. And there's also all kinds of racial and gender biases and prejudices that are being put on this, where you're essentially blaming poor women, women of color, and for kind of causing these problems that really they're the victims of, and they're the victims of the consumption in high income countries that are predominantly Caucasian a lot of the time.
So let's, in terms of that, let's talk a little bit more, if we can, about the feed conversion ratios, because, you know, I think when I looked it up, so the major meat exporters, so this is where the meat's coming from, is Brazil, Australia, and India. And then the major meat importers, of course, are the US, Canada's probably involved in there, most of Europe and the UK, and China and some Pacific Island countries. So if we're thinking about food distribution and food that's grown to feed animals, and then people who are actually consuming or getting to consume the most calories, like say in the US is one of the biggest importers of animal foods. What are those feed conversion ratios? Like say somebody's growing, like here in Canada, we grow a lot of wheat, and I know that it's not all going to human consumption. So if that is then going to feed, like say, chickens and pigs and cows, how many calories are you getting off of those animal-based foods versus if you were just to eat something made of wheat?
Yeah, so very important question, and the numbers, as I mentioned, we're going to talk about what's conventionally out there, and then what is a more realistic number. So it matters, and it doesn't matter in terms of what's imported versus what's locally grown, right? So and the numbers will vary based on animal breed and size and the types of feed, but generally, I think if people who have been listening for a long time or who have known the issues for a long time, again, going back to Francis Moore-Lepay, a lot of times in the veg communities, you'll hear 16-1 for cows. So the idea that cows eat 16 pounds of grain for every pound of beef. And it's a very useful kind of just ballpark to use. And in terms of wheat, I just also want to say you're not just trading up calories. So there's an idea sometimes that you're trading up calories, but it's also soy. The calorie conversion and the protein conversion ratios are actually quite similar. So you can also count this as protein to protein. Mm-hmm. And then of course the feed crops are monocultures, but you can have much more diversity if you're not using feed crops, which is better for the environment and crop safety in terms of resilience to the elements and all kinds of things. But if you are to hear industry numbers, I'm going to talk about cow. I'll bring it back to chickens and pigs for a minute, but we'll talk about cows because they're the ones we hear a lot. And cows are the most. So the bigger the animal, the bigger the feed conversion ratio. So the more inefficient they are, the more crops they have to eat per pound that they're going to give. And the industry will say 7-1. So they say cows eat, and these are factory farm cows. These are not grass-fed cows. A lot of times they're split, so it's partly feedlot and then partly grazed. And I feel like we actually didn't touch grazing enough, so we'll circle back around to how harmful grazing is. At some point, because people have this idealistic sense of what grazing is. Same with homesteading. We didn't. There's so much we can talk about forever. Oh wow, we're at time. Okay.
Yeah, we're pretty close to, I think, yeah, close to time. But I mean, we could always continue this in like a separate interview, or like keep going if you still had time.
And then we'll break it up. Okay, all right. I'll try to at least clear this point. Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
So the industry will say 7-1. The distinction is between live weight ratio, and then there's butcher weight ratio, which you don't need to think about, and then edible weight ratio. And so they're going to use 7-1 because they want the most efficient to be known while still being able to speak to each other about what that means. But it's going to be 1/3 to 1/2, usually more like 1/3 of what the edible ratio. So once you take out the bones and the blood and all the non-edible parts and the parts that people aren't going to eat, what's actually packaged is more like 25 pounds to create a pound of meat. And so of beef. And so what I would like to use as an example for that is if you're eating, say, a 1/4 pounder hamburger, or just a hamburger. Say it's a hamburger patty that's 100 calories of actual beef. That took 2,500 global calories to create that one little hamburger patty. And so when we're talking about, taking resources from the world's poor for animal feed, like this is that. When we're talking about all the extra resources and energy, water used to create the crops that are then fed to the animals. And I know we talked about animal waste, or not food waste a little bit, but this is a form of food waste. This is a form of overconsumption. That 2,500 calories is a day's worth of calories for many people. And we just, boom, consumed it in one little hamburger patty. So that is a much more realistic number to use. You could also count those grazing calories, the calories of the grass and hay, like that's not free. Like that, there's environmental cost to that. So if we were to actually count their full calories, it's even much greater than that. So edible calories versus live weight. We have this chart on our website, and these numbers are by Blockhob Schmiel. He's a researcher. He is not, I mean, I hate to say he's not vegetarian or vegan, but that matters for people to know that he's just a researcher who works on agricultural issues. He's not somebody who is trying to have a particular agenda around it. And so pigs are closer to 10. They're like 9.4. So if you think about eating a piece of pork, that's a 10-1 loss. And then chicken, they will say that chickens and poultry, also they're not mammals, so there's a little more like efficiency. 2-1 is what they'll say. It's more like 4-1. But I think this is really important because we're talking about food waste and how horrible it is. And nobody speaks out against trying to not waste food, right? Nobody's gonna, even if they mean it, like maybe the food manufacturer's like, yeah, waste food because it's more more we get to make you pay for. But nobody's gonna speak out against it. We had the UN Right to Food director talking about biofuels as being a crime against humanity because of the diversion of crops towards biofuels, which is less than 5%. And we've got 1/3 of the global resources, crops going towards livestock. So if you care about biofuels, he cares about it, called it a crime against humanity in terms of diversion. This is a much more greater diversion. But in terms of waste, we were shocked at like 50% waste. That's horrible. Like how horrible. And even in chicken, the most efficient, we're losing 4-1 or 2-1. You're losing 75% of your calories. You're losing 50% of the calories. We don't have to have it. And so that we're just clinging, trying to make excuses, trying to have, oh, well, we'll create our own. We'll raise our own and slaughter our own. And it's horrible to the psyche what it takes to slaughter an animal. Again, if it was really, I'm not anti-speciesist to the point of like if it was me or them, You know, if it's a human or a non-human, then I'm okay. You're going to do what you do to survive. But it's not. We're not at that case predominantly.
Yeah.
And so homesteading again has this kind of idealistic version of what that is. But if it's not needed, it's still animal abuse.
Mhm.
You're
Yeah.
still slaughtering an animal that doesn't need to be. And sometimes I don't know. I mean, I'm just going to assume that they have a luxurious life, but that's often not the case either. And
Yeah, I
so,
think it's a lot of people are at least here, like there's that movement towards being local and trying to, you know, support local businesses, and that homesteading thing kind of goes in there, trying to be sustainable. And I think it's just not quite understanding what it means to be sustainable. So I think, I mean, we could talk forever about all of this stuff, and there's a few things I want to cover, but I think what would be a good note to end on for today is this one question I want to ask, and then we could talk about what people can do. So, you know, ideally, if you could sum up, like, what would an efficient, sustainable food production system look like?
so it would be a mix because you are still going to have the larger scale agriculture that is part of the system. I don't think there's a way around it given realistically our culture, at least in the any type of short term.
Mhm.
But to increase, yes, local farming and community farming, household farming, but you don't need animals for that. And a lot of times it's better without animals. So you use compost as fertilizer. That's you don't need animal food. I actually would prefer my carrots not come. Um, but anyway, so yeah, you know, and you have these vibrant systems that are using diverse ecosystem friendly ways of giving pollinators food. We're able to have the land, you put the trees up and it helps with the water, and there's all kinds of ways to manage these systems, and you teach people about it, you prioritize it, you give it resources for that, and so that you have the local foods, and then you also still are going to have large scale production, but definitely shifting away from animal production, doing more with education so that people are brought up on healthy foods and desire healthy foods. If we're talking idealistically, you know, I'm against Doritos, you know, and sodas, you know, ideal, you know, if we're talking about ideals, then we're really going to get away. And that doesn't mean you can't have treats, but you know, it's not those kinds of treats,
Yeah,
right?
they wouldn't be like, you know, the whole supermarket wouldn't be devoted to processed foods. You'd have it actually be reversed. And
Yeah,
most of
I mean,
it
we would be
is,
health focused, and
yeah.
again, providing food so that we could grow up that way, and that's how we know to nourish and feed ourselves and not just be addicted to these junk foods, including meat and dairy. And we didn't really get to touch on it, but cheese is the number 3 greenhouse gas emitting food because or greenhouse gas impacting food because it's ruminant animals and it's concentrated dairy.
Mhm.
So I know cheese is tough and people really are literally addicted to it because of the casein.
Yes. Mhm.
But the vegan ones are so much better than they used to be. So you know, give it a try. Maybe mix it up if you're still addicted to cheese. I get it. But you know, whatever you can do to reduce, and if you're giving up meat, to not increase dairy. So
Mhm.
that's always what I talk to people about in terms of whatever they can do to reduce consumption, minimize, eliminate. Eliminate is best. Minimize, reduce, whatever you're doing. Um, don't increase cheese if you're starting with meat. A lot of people start with meat. You
Yeah.
could even start with cheese and dairy.
Mhm.
That's how harmful it is.
Yeah. And okay, I'd like to just talk about if you could mention some of the programs and initiatives that A Well-Fed World is helping to help create sustainable food systems. And then a bit like what you were talking about, we could address, you know, what the average person can do to contribute to developing more sustainable food systems.
Okay. Well, the program so close to my heart is called Plants for Hunger.
Mhm.
And again, it's on our website at AWFW.org.
Mhm.
And this is a alternative to, say, Heifer International and Oxfam that is giving animal gifts. So it's either giving live or dead animals, basically, is what most hunger programs are. And so this is supporting, we pick 4 groups and we collect funds. So usually it's holiday gifts. Like that's when people want to often give for holidays or birthdays. They, when people are not trying to be consumerist or whatever, and they give a gift of a feeding program. So this is great for vegetarians and vegans to receive because it's not using animals, and then also to give. So, say if I want to give something to my uncle and I want to support a feeding program, but he's not veg and he doesn't want to support, a vegan advocacy group, but but is in favor of having feeding programs, then this is still good for that. And so the Ethiopian school lunch program that I just kind of briefly touched on, that we partner with, and we support school lunch program, seeds, so giving seeds to countries, fruit trees. We've been doing a lot more with food trees, and which also gives us the reforestation. We didn't get to touch on deforestation, so much we could talk about, and then community gardens or home gardens, so food gardens, and supporting in the U.S. and India and Peru.
I'd like to mention too, I think your foundation grants cover your operating costs, or a well-fed world's operating costs. So if people donate to these programs, 100% of their donation goes towards them.
Yes, which is great, because also I get to then just unabashedly say, donate to these programs. We don't keep any of it. We send 100%. We absorb all the administration fees. We know these groups directly that we're working with. They're small. So in terms of impact, Heifer International budget is over $100 million. Wow. It doesn't have the impact. We give to these groups. They're small. They're in countries where the dollar goes far, and they're really able to get a lot from it. Well, also the U.S. But they still are able to leverage a lot of good. It makes a much bigger impact when you donate to a smaller group, oftentimes, than a larger group, and not just in larger groups. But yeah, we have foundation grants that cover all our operating costs, so we're very fortunate in that. And then we're able to use donations to either give out as grants. We have a granting program, and or the feeding programs, which we do some support of with our grants, but then any money that's targeted to the feeding programs, we give to them.
Great. So a person here, like, who's listening, they could consider donating to one of the Well-Fed World organizations, or who they're helping. We could, like we talked about, get interested in growing your own, get interested in looking things up, researching. One of the things I really like that I learned about from Dr. Pam Popper is prescriptive communication. And we hear all these terms like eat less of this, eat more of this, and honestly, that's left up to interpretation. So it's kind of nice to be able to say, like, give something that's a bit more concise and less vague. So in terms of like what the average person can do in their day-to-day, say they have like a 9-to-5 job and they're supporting their family, what are some things they could focus on doing today and just continue doing daily?
I mean, plant-based diet's number one. So if whatever you can do to move towards a plant-based diet, that is key. If again, people have different complicated relationships with that, so that's why we say minimize. But minimize, ideally eliminate. So number one, that's where you're just going to do an immense amount of good. We didn't even talk about deforestation. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's just, there's so many things wrong with the animal food system, no matter where you are in that. So getting out of that system is best. And then on top of that, if you eat less processed foods and things of that nature, reduce your junk foods. I mean, Oreos are vegan. We don't promote Oreos, but hey, if you're gonna, you can still. There's plenty of junk food. I'm going out for pizza tonight. Yeah. And then try to have a positive attitude. Be connecting with others. So after your own individual diet is being able to spread the word and be an ambassador, and so for people they can just talk about this genuinely and kindly, right? So, oh, you're eating plant-based, right? Like, oh, are you not eating meat or whatever it is? And if it's for the environment, whatever is the motivator, but people will hear it's like, oh, this is something I'm trying to do to reduce my greenhouse gas emissions. And they don't have to say it in a way that's blaming. They just talk about like, oh, that's why I drive a hybrid. It's just part of a tool, and that's how we also frame it. Is it's a tool in your toolbox. It doesn't have to be a hammer, right? Like not everything's a hammer. And just something you can do and be an example. And then I have a friend who just so kind of I think it's brilliant and obvious, right? But he would say most people eat meat because most people eat meat.
Mm-hmm.
And so whether you're all the way vegetarian or vegan, the more along you are, the increases demand that most of this fuel of the plant-based food products are actually being fueled by reductionists, people who are eating it sometimes. And so you're part of that. Everything you do is like part of that. You're making it more acceptable because your friends and family see it. It makes it more mainstream. It adds to the demand, and then just being a good example. And maybe Veganuary is coming up. I'm going to give a plug for Veganuary.
Yeah,
It's a great way to start for the month. And if you're already vegetarian, you could be vegan. If you're already vegan, you're like, hey, I'm going to go Whole Foods for Veganuary or whatever it is. But check out Veganuary because we're part of the partnership for that.
I'd like to end with, because I know you're a founding board director of Beyond Carnism. So you were talking a bit about this kind of, it's positive advocacy. When people do their own research or they discover things where, they get a bit upset about not having known how detrimental some of their, food choices were, or some of their previous actions were. And, it can, for somebody who does change, there can be that kind of antagonism towards the way things used to be for them. And they kind of direct that at people who haven't changed. I mean, what kind of advice would you give to somebody who has newly changed over and, feels that sense of antagonism?
Well, I guess try to manage it. Try to when you convey information to be intentional about it. So sometimes having some energy and some anger around things, like if you're protesting, that's intentional. But sometimes you're just angry and frustrated at people. It's hard to be aware of issues and just to be vegan in a non-vegan world where especially if it's not just health motivated, if you're motivated by the injustice and to see it and why aren't people changing, and just understand that it's again, most people eat meat because most people eat meat, where it's so indoctrinated, and that being a good example, it's just not going to help most people to have somebody come hard at them, and how they would like to be addressed, and what's been effective for them. Did somebody come hard at them? Now the thing is it actually does work with some people. I'm actually if somebody comes hard at me about something, it actually will impact me. But I'm a social justice activist, and I think we maybe have a little bit different wiring than people more generally. But I also know the person who was vegan came at me kindly, and she gave me an audio cassette tape, for people who know what an audio cassette tape is, of Dr. Clapper.
Oh my God.
So, and she was patient with me because it didn't just happen overnight. I was writing my master's thesis on the plant-based, the need to go plant-based for global hunger reasons, and I was still popping M&Ms. I was vegan at that point, except I was still popping M&Ms until I finished.
Yeah. Yeah, it is a process. And I'd like to thank you so much for giving us some of your time. And we've covered a lot. And like you said, there's so much more that we could talk about. But it just seems that having that plant-based focus can just give you an overall positive effect on your impact in the world.
It's the thing I'm most proud of anything that I was able to do. I'm like, at least this piece, I feel good about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm going to provide some links for for people to go and visit. Well-Fed World is a wonderful website and resource. There's a great infographic that links up to the environmental impacts. And we didn't talk about the 51%, but we'll link up to Robert Goodland's interview where he talks about that and some other resources. So people, dig in and be informed. And thank you so much, Ms. Moncrief. And we'll definitely follow a Well-Fed World's progress and help to support it.
Thank you. And if people want to know about the 51%, we have information specifically on the website. They use the 20-year time frame instead of 100. A lot of deforestation. So there's reasons. But like with the transportation, whether it's 51% or 14, it's a lot, and we need to take it seriously.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you.